Tenderhearted, the podcast for those of us who struggle with being extra sensitive in a less than sensitive world. This is your host, Amy Kelso. I'm a writer, speaker, teacher, and advocate for anyone who is tenderhearted or cares about someone who is. Okay, hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Tenderhearted podcast. I, again, am your host, Amy Kelso. Today, what I want to talk about is I want to get into a little more detail about what is a tender heart and what a tender heart isn't necessarily. So the term tenderhearted or tender heart is something, obviously we know that we've known the word forever, but it's kind of a term that I came up with to describe a very specific type of person. And the interesting thing with the word is that usually when I say that, people understand automatically. It's like you have a visual of, oh, that kid or that person, or like we all know who a tender heart is. And that's one of the nice things about the power of that word is it automatically evokes a feeling. So what, though, is a tender heart? So one of the things I kind of mentioned in the first podcast, there is a term for people called the highly sensitive person, which is someone who has higher sensitivity to outside stimulus than others. And the term was coined by Elaine Aron in the 90s. And she did a lot of research and was found that about 20% of the population is what she calls highly sensitive, which just means that their senses are more aware than others, right? Most times, tender heart, I think, is a highly sensitive person, but a highly sensitive person isn't necessarily a tender heart. Because for me, what really makes a tender heart stand out is their level of empathy. Where they can really put themselves into someone else's shoes, to the point where I think most tender hearts probably are a bit of an empath. So let's talk about what is an empath, right? And again, this isn't necessarily a scientific term or anything, but an empath can sense the emotions of the people that they're around. Now, there's arguments about whether or not that's happening just, like a sixth sense where they know it, or if it's just the observation using all of their other 5 senses to pick it up, which is quite possible too. You learn to really pay attention to all the subtle cues the people around you give, how they're speaking, their tone of voice, their behavior, little things that most people perhaps don't pick up on, a tender heart will notice. And kind of, because of that, they feel that they can sense what the people around them are feeling. So that would be perhaps the more scientific explanation, or again, it could just be a sixth sense where they can kind of feel it more. So a tender heart, in my opinion, though, is usually partly empath. They can feel the emotions of others, or they can sense them, and that affects everything in your life, right? As somebody who is a total opposite would be somebody who doesn't have any sense of the feelings of people around them. They go through life and don't even notice, think about, or care about those around them. Whereas the tender heart, it's like we can't even help but notice the feelings around us. And part of the secret of being a tender heart is learning to understand that, knowing what does it mean when you can feel the emotions of those around you? What doesn't it mean? And I think that is kind of an important thing that an empath on their own doesn't necessarily have someone help guide them about this. So the important things to remember, one thing that I realized very late in life, where I came up with realizing that even though I can feel somebody's emotions, they're feeling happy, they're sad, they're grumpy, whatever emotions they're feeling, that did not necessarily mean that I could read their mind. And for a long time, I felt like I could. Like, I know that they're upset. I can tell they're upset, so therefore, they must be upset at me, which is usually what it came down to. I always felt like, well, those emotions were my fault. I was in charge of them. I had to fix them. And so that, for me, just first of all, understanding that even though I know that they're feeling upset, that doesn't mean I know why they're upset. And it's not fair for me to assume that I do. And it's not fair for me specifically to assume that it must be my fault, which is what I know I did a lot, I think is very common for tender hearts to feel like if somebody's upset, it's my job to fix that, which is the second part. So the two things with being an empath is A, just because you can feel emotions doesn't mean you can read minds and you don't know why necessarily those emotions are happening. And B, just because you can feel someone else's emotions does not mean that you are required to do something about it. And that is really hard. I think a lot of times when you can feel the emotions of those around you, especially from a young age, you grow up in a situation perhaps where emotions are running high or whatever, you take that on and feel like it is my job to make everyone around me happy. And therefore, you become this very wonderful, loving person. You're always worried about others, which is a wonderful thing. But there is a catch. And one of the things I think is important to remember or to consider is that even though sometimes an empath would seem like, the most caring, compassionate person, there is also a slightly selfish side to it. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. You want those around you to be happy because you want them to be happy, yes, but also because you can feel when they're happy and you can feel when they're not, right? You don't want to feel people being upset around you, which is why you end up feeling like you're in charge of everyone's emotions. You got to keep everyone happy because you don't want to feel their anger, their frustration, all of those bad feelings. You're feeling as if they're your own. Well, of course, then you're going to try to keep them at bay, right? So you're going to try to make sure everyone around you feels good so that you can feel good. But obviously that can be a trap because first of all, you can't control other people's feelings. And when you try to make sure that everybody is happy, generally what happens is you neglect your own feelings. And that in the long run will work against you. So things to consider if you are an empath or if you know someone who is, help them to kind of understand these important things. Just because you understand feelings doesn't mean you know why they're feeling that way. So the only way to really know what someone is really feeling and why they're feeling it is to actually ask them, talk to them, not just assume that you know. And the second very important thing is to remember that you are not responsible for cheering someone up, for making someone feel better. Even though you can feel the feelings and you might not like them, you have to respect that people have a right to have their feelings. So anyway, so that's kind of went off on a kind of tangent, which happens. But the point is, a tender heart is someone who is highly sensitive, but specifically someone who has extra strong sense of emotions around them, that empathy, that understanding of people, what's going on, and how everyone is interacting. That, I think, is what makes a tender heart stand out from just a highly sensitive person. So in my mind, a tender heart probably is a highly sensitive person, but just because you're a highly sensitive person doesn't necessarily mean you're a tender heart. The other thing I just want to point out real clearly, tender heart is not a specific diagnosis. There is no official, I'm going to get my diagnosis from my therapist to tell me I'm a tender heart. It is a term to understand a certain type of people. And I purposely, that is kind of in purpose, that it is not a specific diagnosis. It's just a way to understand people. And I think that's important too. So those are just some things I wanted to clarify about tender hearts before I get too far into this podcast. Hopefully that helps explain it a little. If you have more questions, let me know. Leave a comment. Reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. And I will talk to you next Tenderhearted Tuesday.